the empty garage. The garage door was open. That was the first thing I noticed, and it froze me solid, because my husband Harold never once left it open in 42 years of marriage. I set my coffee down and walked outside, and the space where his prized 1967 Shelby GT500 had sat for 20 years was empty. Harold had died 8 months earlier, and that car was the last living piece of him I had left, built piece by piece with his own hands, meant for a retirement road trip we never got to take. Minutes later, my son Trevor pulled into the driveway with his wife Renee. He admitted he had sold the Shelby for $15,000 to fund Renee's business trip to Paris. Renee, polished and cold, told me flatly that Harold was dead and Trevor needed to build his own life. I stayed calm, years of nursing had taught me that, but inside, I was shattered. They left for the airport the next morning, and I stood alone in that empty garage holding Harold's work journal against my chest. The next morning, a man named Mike Sullivan called. He owned a classic car dealership, and he said he had Harold's Shelby and something Harold wanted me to know. I drove across town in a daze. Mike told me Harold had saved his life 25 years earlier by co-signing a loan no bank would touch. When Trevor sold him the car, Mike recognized it instantly and paid the $15,000, knowing full well it was worth nearly $180,000. He led me to the car and told me Harold had installed a hidden compartment behind the dashboard 2 years before he died, and made him swear to make sure I found it if anything ever happened. Inside that compartment was a manila folder, a sealed letter addressed to me, and a small wooden box with a key. Harold's letter explained that he had spent 18 months secretly investigating Renee. Her real name wasn't Renee at all. She had married and financially destroyed at least 2 other men before Trevor, always targeting families with aging parents and property, always vanishing once she drained everything. He hadn't told me because he needed undeniable proof before Trevor would ever believe it. The folder held marriage certificates, photographs of Renee at 2 other weddings, and news clippings about families losing everything. The wooden box held a key to a safe deposit box containing stock certificates worth over $300,000, money Harold had quietly saved to protect my future. I called the 2 men from the letters, and their stories matched exactly. Renee had convinced one to sell his mother's house for an unnecessary care facility, then vanished with the money. She had convinced the other to sell his father's business, then disappeared to Costa Rica. A private investigator named Frank, who had secretly been working with Harold before he died, showed me she had opened fraudulent credit cards in Trevor's name and was already planning her next move, convincing Trevor I was declining so they could sell my house next. I confronted Trevor with everything. He was furious and stormed out, but that night he called both men himself and heard the truth firsthand. He went home and tested Renee with simple questions, and her answers didn't match anything she'd told him before. When he pushed about the credit cards, her mask fell away completely. She packed a bag, called him weak, and walked out. Frank tracked her to an airport hotel. She had booked a one-way flight to Mexico City at 6 that morning, carrying stacks of cash. Frank also discovered her real identity was stolen. The actual Vanessa Cortland had died years earlier, and this woman was a serial con artist wanted in 2 other states. We met detectives at the airport before dawn. When they approached her, she bolted, kicking off her heels and sprinting through the terminal before security tackled her. Her suitcase held nearly $50,000 in cash and a passport under yet another false name. When she saw Trevor and me watching, she screamed that he was pathetic and that I should have minded my own business. Police dragged her away as she kept shouting threats. She eventually took a plea deal for 12 years in federal prison, with several more victims coming forward once her identity was exposed. Trevor's marriage was annulled since it had never legally existed. He moved back home, started therapy, and slowly began healing. One day I found him in the garage crying over Harold's old journal, devastated that his final conversation with his father had been an argument about Renee. I gave him Harold's letter, the one saying Trevor was a victim too, and that he understood. My son finally broke down completely, and I held him the way I once held him as a boy. 2 months later, Mike Sullivan drove the Shelby back into our driveway and refused any payment, saying it had always belonged to our family. We backed it into its old spot in the garage, and the space finally smelled like Harold again, motor oil and old leather. Months after that, Trevor and I sat in that car together for the first time, following Harold's careful notes step by step, checking fluids and systems exactly as his journal instructed. On a warm spring morning, I finally drove it myself, with Trevor beside me, the engine rumbling deep and steady beneath us. He laughed for the first time in months and said his father would have loved seeing this. Driving down our quiet street with the windows down, I understood that even in death, Harold had never stopped protecting us, quietly building a shield around the people he loved most, and leaving it behind for us to find exactly when we needed it.